Morning, everybody. Buen día a todos.
Yeah.
So let's get started. Let me introduce you. You already have met the Dean of the School of Engineering here at UNM, Donna Riley. She's going to give us a talk. Start with her and we'll follow up with Jane Katzman from the health sciences. Today I'll be mainly on the health sciences topics. And thank you, Donna, for being here. There's two Donnas, Donna Riley. There's a Donna. Just make sure isn't the right Donna. Thank you for being here, and the microphone is yours.
All right. Thank you so much, Ramiro. Let me try to get this going. Does that look right? Should look more or less right. All right, that looks more or less right. Here, let me minimize that. All right, so it's my pleasure to be here with you today. I might stand up, just it's me here.
Right, that X.
Oh, on the X.
Yeah.
All right. I am gonna have to, I have slides, so I will be advancing those. I'm admitting people, hopefully that's okay. So I wanted to let me just back up and give just a little bit of an intro here that what I thought I would do today. First of all, I'm sorry I couldn't be here on Monday. I had gotten called into a different meeting. So I'm here a little late. My original plan was to kind of do an intro type of talk. But what I hope this might provide is a kind of a place-based perspective on a way we might approach a definition of peace engineering, starting from where we are rooted here in New Mexico. I am new to New Mexico, so this is for me a first attempt at really thinking through some of these issues. So I'm interested, for those of you that are new to New Mexico with me, you might have some thoughts as well based on what you've been learning. So I wanted to begin with our university's Indigenous Peoples Land and Territory Acknowledgement. I don't know if you all have seen this yet at this conference, but the University of New Mexico was founded in 1889, and it sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia. And the original peoples of New Mexico, who are many, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize our history. And I'm going to use this as the basis of a generation of a definition of peace engineering today. Also this week, UNM celebrated Juneteenth for the first time as an official university holiday. I don't know how much you all learned about Juneteenth, but it is a holiday that has its origins in one state over in Texas, where after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued and after the Civil War ended, there was a bit of a struggle in some Confederate states to ensure the liberation of enslaved Black Americans. And so we are now celebrating the history of the liberation of Black peoples that comes through a struggle that should be acknowledged. And so at UNM, one of our student classes, the Black Minds Matter class, which was part of a first-year experience, developed a labor acknowledgement for this university. And it says, at UNM, we respectfully acknowledge the traumatic history of forced labor of Black Americans who have advanced our country. We are indebted to the enslaved and exploited African Americans who established our US infrastructure and economy, advanced civil rights, and continue to influence popular culture. We are obligated to continuously recognize historic and current systemic oppression and injustices placed on Black Americans. We are grateful to their ancestors, for without them, we would not be where we are today. And in this particular moment where Texas has this week banned the diversity programs in its universities, I think it's especially important to acknowledge this history and the struggle that continues today. It is also Pride Month, and next week is the anniversary of the Stonewall riot. And there are connections here where Stonewall happened because of police oppression of gay and trans Americans who were meeting at the Stonewall Inn, a bar in Greenwich Village. And it is not coincidental that a lot of that struggle was among Brown and Black Americans who were more often targets of police violence and gender nonconforming Americans, right? So, so I say all of this as an introduction to begin with a place-based understanding of peace engineering. And one of the important things about this place is that 130 miles south of us, on July 16th, 1945, the first atomic weapon was tested at the Trinity site. And the man in charge of the test at the Trinity site was an electrical engineer named Kenneth Bainbridge. And I would posit that he may be an early peace engineer in the state of New Mexico. One of the things that happened is that he agonized over the Trinity test for fear that the gadget that they had developed at Los Alamos National Labs might not detonate, and it would be his job to go inspect what happened if it didn't detonate. It in fact did detonate, and it made an incredible crater in White Sands National Monument. And it also really impressed upon him and Oppenheimer and the others that were part of the Manhattan Project, what an awesomely terrible weapon they had invented. In that moment, in that flash, he turned to Oppenheimer and he said, "Now we are all sons of bitches." And what he meant by that was that the world would judge what they had done in developing this weapon of mass destruction that they knew in a few short weeks was going to decimate Japanese peoples. So, so we begin with this, and on July 16th, the same day, 34 years later, 130 miles west of here, there was the largest nuclear accident in US history. And it's a history that people outside the state of New Mexico are often completely unaware about. And it was a dam breach. So the United Nuclear Corporation had been holding on private land a mine and milling operation for uranium fuel. And they had been processing that, and there were mine tailings, and there was sludge that contained heavy metals, uranium, and other radioactive materials. The dam had a crack in it that was known about for 2 years. And on July 16th, 1979, which was, by the way, just a couple months after the 3 Mile Island accident, on that day, that crack turned into a 20-foot breach of the dam. And while the milling operation and mining operation itself was on private land, the release sent all of this radioactive material into the Puerto River and onto Navajo land. And so what ensued was a lack of response from both state and federal officials. So the governor of the state of New Mexico refused to declare the site a disaster area. The Indian Health Service, the EPA, for years minimized the extent of the problem and the effect that it had on this particular band of Navajo that lived near and relied upon the Puerto River for grazing cattle and so on. And it got to the point where in the early 2000s, so we're talking about 30 some, 25, 30 years later, they instituted a Navajo-led monitoring project. So a type of citizen science, if you will, where members of the Navajo Nation, in collaboration with folks from Donna College and here at the University of New Mexico, monitored the radiation and documented the continuing contamination of the land at Church Rock. And so here are, I posit, peace engineers monitoring the contamination on that land in the early 2000s. So with that, I sort of turn to the definition that Arnie Veseland offered back in 2005. He wrote a book called Peace Engineering, which if you haven't seen it, it's a pretty good intro to peace engineering. It's a collection of essays. And he says in that book that peace engineering is the proactive use of engineering skills to promote the peaceful and just existence for all people. It's a simple and concise definition, but it's also one that raises, I think, a lot of questions, which is, what does that mean to create a peaceful and just existence for all people? And most importantly, who decides? Who decides what's just? Who decides what peace is and for whom? And I would also suggest that the answers can't just come from engineers. The answer to that question is not just a matter of engineering skills, although Arnie might argue with me. I did know him, and I know he would probably say those engineering skills are much broader than one might imagine. So we can argue about what engineering is as well. And so this raises some questions that I've worked on for a while in my own career, which is how has engineering furthered injustice or undermined peace? And I think we really have to reckon with that. So in the same way that my acknowledgments at the beginning here around the holiday of Juneteenth and around land and territory acknowledgements around understanding that Pride Month isn't just a celebration, it's also a commemoration of a hard-fought struggle. We need to really think about engineering's history and its participation in colonialism and racism and sexism and all of these other forms of oppression that we have to be countering. So, so to then imagine how could it be otherwise, we have to first reckon with how it has been. So that then also suggests that engineering knowledge might need to change. What constitutes engineering skills needs to shift. How we practice engineering would also need to change. Who gets to be an engineer may need to change. And then there's I think, a very provocative question about what the role of social movements is in this work, because in fact, if I begin to talk about these struggles, those are led by leaders of social movements, and engineers have not traditionally been part of those social movements. And so what does it mean to connect those two things? And then how does our sense of place matter? So does it matter if we are in New Mexico or if we are in Argentina? I know you've been doing water case studies, and in fact, clearly just the presence of water alone changes, right? What the considerations are. And so would the colonial histories in different places and so on. So I would argue that place matters. And as a side note, I want to just recognize that this history of these conversations goes back long before Arnie's work in 2005, and that a recommended book I would suggest if you're interested in the US-based history is to look at Matt Wisnowski's book, Engineers for Change, which talks about the 1960s and movements of engineers for, there's a group called Science for the People that did a lot of work about the defense establishment and engineering's connection to it. There was a group called VITA, Volunteers in Technical Assistance, that was deeply involved in the Engineering for Development project and engineering disaster relief. And the appropriate technology movement and environmental justice movements that date back to the 1960s and 70s are all, I think, important historical examples and role models for us to think about. I drew this Venn diagram. I'm not sure that I am fully committed to it, but I've been thinking about the relationship of different discussions of types of engineering. So I've been around for a little while. When I was first starting my faculty career, there was a lot of talk about engineering for development. Bernard Amadei had just founded Engineers Without Borders USA, which was building on both Engineers Without Borders movements and Doctors Without Borders movements, that which of course are much older. And Engineers for Change was started in the early 2000s. And so there was a focus on how engineering can help with global development. And then that also brought on critiques from development studies of, are we reenacting colonial relationships and doing engineering for development? And then there was sort of a humanitarian engineering movement that launched that is not just about development work, but also about disaster relief and immediate assistance for folks in need. And then I think peace engineering sits even broader outside of that, asking even larger questions. The thing that I am not sure about, even though Arnie Veselin's definition includes justice, I'm not sure that all peace engineering conversations have a deep focus on justice and fully account for injustice. To what extent are power structures and power dynamics understood as part of peace engineering? To what extent are the trajectories and histories around racism and colonialism and other kinds of injustice fully taken into account in peace engineering? Is epistemic injustice considered, that our knowledge itself has built-in biases? Critical questions that diagnose injustice, are they part of peace engineering? And is there an authentic and empowered inclusion of communities in peace engineering efforts? And I think in some cases, yes, but also in some cases, maybe less so. And so I think this is a challenge to the peace engineering community to do this authentically. And this is difficult work, and it takes iteration, and it takes continued learning, right? And as someone who's been involved in the engineering, social justice, and peace conversations, I would say the inverse is true there, where the social justice conversations that are happening there don't always think about peace. And in fact, there's an active debate about peaceful versus non-peaceful tactics for justice, right, in that community. So that's another sort of thing to acknowledge about these two things that are very interlapping. There's lots of people in both, involved in both things, but how these conversations happen is important. And I wanted to just close with one story from my own kind of upbringing, that when I was a student in college, I took a class from a man named Frank von Hippel. And he started his career at Argonne National Labs. He's a physicist. He did solid state physics, but then became an expert in arms reduction and nuclear non-proliferation and the technical aspects of that. So one of the things in his career that was really important is he got involved in the nuclear freeze movement in the 80s as a physicist working on nuclear technology. And this is something that I think today we would consider odd or breaching some sort of rule about objectivity of science. But at the time, that was not that unusual in the tradition of these folks from the Manhattan Project who had gotten very involved in Bainbridge had worked towards the rest of his career towards test ban treaties and towards non-proliferation efforts. And so folks in the physics community had been doing that. And he, in that tradition, I think, was involved in the freeze movement. And this was a time when the United States and the Soviet Union were in extremely strained diplomatic relations. And one of the things that the freeze movement enabled scientists to do in both the Soviet Union and the US was meet to talk in technical terms about what arms reductions would entail and to figure out exactly where production would stop, who would do what. And having figured that out, they each went and lobbied their own governments, and that was the seeds of the START treaties. And so one of the things that he said in class to us is he said this multiple times. He really would say, "Blessed are the troublemakers." And he talked about the value of the social movement for zeroing out nuclear weapons, which he did not personally support or do in his own life as a physicist. But he felt that the movement provided a kind of a moral anchor where the prospect of having a world without nuclear weapons enabled the conversation to proceed around what kinds of reductions might be possible. It made them seem more moderate, in other words, right? So all this is to say, I know I've talked a bit about nuclear stuff because it is a big part of the history here in New Mexico, but it's not the only place-based connections one might make for New Mexico. And in particular, I think about dry lands. The peoples here have since time immemorial dealt with drought, dealt with the conditions here, which are harsh and require both cooperation and different ways of doing things and different types of knowledge. And so the incorporation of those knowledges in understanding resilience for lots of communities living in drought, I think, is important for long-term climate adaptation. There are lots of renewable energy resources here. If you've been here a little bit, there's wind, there's plentiful sunshine. There's even water up north. So there are opportunities for us to think about local renewable energy resources and different ways to manage and administer those locally. And then lastly, I would propose a third option of digital cultural wealth, that there is incredible cultural wealth here because of our layered history and diversity of populations here in the state. And I think that there's a lot that engineers can do to collaborate in the sort of space of arts and tech that I think is unique to New Mexico. And there are other things, of course, but so with that, those are my remarks. So
Thank you.
Questions?
Sure, Bruce.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about the contribution of financial markets to supporting East engineering and where have we gone right and where could we use some additional instruments?
So I think there's lots of different models out there and they've had different consequences, right? So one of the very popular examples has been Grameen banking, right? So to take that as an example, I think that this sort of microloans and these ideas have on the one hand created opportunities for capital to move where it otherwise wouldn't, but it sometimes can concentrate wealth in particular ways that don't benefit everybody, right? So that's sort of a model that was revolutionary because it was able to kind of, by working at a smaller scale, it was able to create flows where there weren't otherwise. And I think that was really important for innovation, but it also had the impact of not necessarily sharing wealth, depending on how it's implemented, right? A lot of times the devil's in the details, right? And there's other examples of more cooperative models that are similar to that. And I think it spurred those ideas of like, well, what if we tweaked this and did this in a more cooperative way? So I think those are important. I think when I think about New Mexico, I think we're really in need of that kind of innovation here because we have no shortage of ideas. What we do have is difficulty crossing the valley of death, as they say, right? So we have ideas, we have startups. There's 1 billion startups in the city of Albuquerque, and they can't get across the valley of death. They have to leave the state to scale. And so figuring out how do we scale in ways that keep resources in the state and also in local communities within the state is something that's really needed. So, Joe.
First, I want to say thank you for a very thoughtful presentation. Using the term valley of death, but now again in the ideas of engineering education and change. See opportunities for peace engineering as an agent of change that can actually pass the valley of death in engineering education, or would this be another skeleton in the desert?
So, so I think that as I think about social movements, right, and this is where I think it's helpful to look back and to see what happened in the 1960s, that there were, and this was something that for me personally was eye-opening. So Matt Wisnowski, the person who wrote Engineers for Change, invited me to give a talk at Virginia Tech back in 2012 or 13. And I had just written a book that was collecting examples from my thermodynamics class. So I had gone in using pedagogies of liberation. So using Paulo Freire's work, really thinking about how do students themselves generate problems and ideas in thermo, and to think about thermo for climate change, to think about, all these things in different contexts. I had no idea that there had been thermodynamics professors before me that had written textbooks with problems about climate change in the 1970s. And I had looked, I had done searches, I'd done my homework, and I did not find those. And Matt had, because he's a historian, he had archival, copies of these things that he had gone and looked at other places than I had. I had looked in university libraries, he had looked in archives, and he was like, look at all these predecessors to your work. And it blew my mind. And so I think and social movements know this, right? So when you look at the Pride movement now that's dealing with the trans kids issues in Texas, anywhere else, they can look back to Stonewall, and they have a story, a history of struggle to build upon. And I think, and before, right, you can go back further. And it's that knowing our history that I think is really important. So peace engineering absolutely has a place. And if it didn't exist, it would need to be invented, right? So, so this conversation, this tension about what else is there is deeply embedded in engineering. And even civil engineering itself as a field was founded because it was civilian engineering as opposed to military engineering. So the first engineering institute in the United States is West Point. It was a military institute. Civil engineering develops around it as not this, we do this. And so peace engineering has that same flavor of it's doing something that engineering has not been in its mainstream doing. Does it become mainstream? I think it could. I think right now, my little Venn diagram of there's clearly lots of engineering for development chapters around, lots of people doing that. How do we have that conversation? There's ethics. Ramiro and I have talked about ethics and the role of ethics in peace engineering. Ethics is a franchise from Purdue University. It's gotten adopted lots of places, but it also, I would say it in many instantiations does not have the justice conversation at the center. So, how do we continue to, have these conversations? There's at this point an academic infrastructure around maybe not just peace engineering, but there's a Journal for Engineering, Social Justice and Peace. There's multiple journals of service learning in engineering. There's, and these are, the Social Justice and Peace journal is in 2 languages. It's in Spanish and English. There's a whole Spanish journal, Spanish language journal that coexists with English language ones. So there's, this is global. It's something that is happening. So I think it will continue, whether it's always called peace engineering, I can't say.
It's not a question, it's just a comment. Thank you so much. This has been so refreshing. The way you mentioned social justice and so many like in social sciences, we usually work with these ideas, but we have this maybe misconception that like in other sciences they do not, or they do not as much as we do. So I can really see a bridge for like cooperation in like different sciences with all of what you said. So thank you so much. It was really wonderful to hear. It's a delight.
Thank you. And I totally agree that the connections need to be made, for the projects I've talked about. There's Native American studies on this campus. Those folks would need to be engaged in this conversation. And Chicano studies is another very rich discipline that exists here in a unique way and at a time when other Chicano studies departments are being decimated. Now is a really good time for us to lend our support to those disciplines because they're as much as we're feeling the hurt as our engineering and diversity programs are going to get decimated in different as states proceed to do what Texas has done. Yeah, I know it's heavy, but it's even heavier in the social sciences where it is the core of some of their work.
So part of what down here at UNM, we created that peace engineering minor, which is open to all the disciplines at the university. And we reached out, I'm part of the Latin American and Iberian Council. So big center here on Latin American studies. The competition's been Texas, Austin, Berkeley, or us. So we're up there. So we reached out and they are pushing also peace engineering. Because of the impact in Latin America, we have so much to demonstrate and do peace engineering. This is why you've heard people from La Plata, Nacional, this is just Argentina, but with ISTEC, we have universities in every country. And as an outcome of the peace engineering conference we organized, University of Sao Paulo, which is ranked #1 in Latin America, they created a peace engineering center. And it's not ended up, so they group all the disciplines. So this is some of the impact. We have a definition, we evolve with based on all the definitions that Donna mentioned. It's not written in stone. We have to be flexible, we have to be agile, we have to adapt, but this is for everybody. We want to change the mindset of every discipline. At the same time, we need to work together. We cannot do it alone. There's no way. And here we started with water, but we got into the engineering thing, the Internet of Things, the data. Do you trust the data? What do you do with the data? Can you visualize? Can you model? So this has been a great event. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the presentation. Any other comments, questions? About complaints? Come on. Thank you.
Yep,
Thank you so much.